Hello, everyone. Welcome, everybody, in my show, Photos and Stories. This is Andrew Biraj, the photographer. Um, Today, I have a spectacular guest with me, and this you'll be very much amazed. And I hope that the day will be very much is fruitful for you. Today, I'm gonna invite the legendary, the most exciting, the most the I'm sorry. Yeah, today I'm gonna invite the most legendary and the greatest photographer, American photographer, Dave Burnett. So before I get him on screen, I'm sorry that I'm getting a little bit difficulties on my screen, but I hope that you all are seeing. So please bear me a little bit. So yeah. So before I get him on the screen, I just want to make a very small, a very brief introduction about him. I know it's not so much necessary, but just for the people who are first time in this show. So David Burnett, he has been covering the war and the people and the stories all around the world for more than 5 decades. So David Burnett has covered Vietnam War, the war in Bangladesh, and as well as he has covered more than 11 Olympics in his career. So he has been very much popular. Very much well known to take pictures with his large format cameras. So as well as he brought out a book on Bob Marley. So we'll be talking about all of these things very shortly. So here, allow me to welcome the great Dave Burnett. Hello, Dave. Hello, Dave. How are you?
It's a pretty good introduction, Henry. Thanks so much, and thanks for doing the show. It is actually, this time when everybody's staying home, or more or less staying home, or we're certainly staying home more than we used to. It's great to have the ability to do these little shows and to kind of reconnect at a time when reconnecting is not always that easy to do.
Absolutely, it's a great honor for me too to have you in my first show. So yeah, it's been a very difficult and very different time for us. So I was just thinking, why not talking about some some very positive things, learning some very nice stories from you. So yeah, so where are you at this moment, David?
I'm in Florida. I came down here the middle of March, and my wife she's no longer a big fan of the snow that we get in the Northeast winter. So she came down here and been staying here for a little while. And I got here in the middle of March, and right after I got here, everything just kind of locked down, and it was wherever you happened to be, that's where you were going to be for the last couple of months. So I'm here. I've been doing, where we're staying is right next to this little island on a golf course, I'm not playing golf, but we're living in a place near a golf course. And there's this big group of trees that every night become the hotel where these hundreds of big water birds come and spend the night. And so watching these birds come in every night, I'm out there with my camera, just kind of like, okay, here come the birds. And it's, it's a little like covering politics, because you never really know what's going to happen. It's like you kind of have an idea that something is supposed to happen. But birds don't. The birds are a little like politicians. They don't always do what you expect that they will do. So anyway, it's been a very interesting time, and I've been, I'm not shooting much. I'm kind of in that older age group that is more susceptible to the COVID virus. So I've been trying to be careful about not get, I have not been out shooting, and honestly, I wrote it to somebody. It was like first time in 50 years that I didn't just pick up my cameras and head to the story. So it's been I'm seeing a lot of really good work that's being done. It's a very challenging time for the society, for everybody, for the journalists, for photographers in particular. But I'm seeing some work that really does, I think, tend to bring you a sense of what's going on, which is what we do as photographers. I mean, it's kind of our main thing. So anyway, pleasure to be here, and happy to show you a few pictures and talk a little bit about. I know that I'm assuming that much of our audience is going to either be in Bangladesh or nearby, or is
Yes,
Bangladeshi and is now maybe living somewhere else. But
yeah, most of our audiences are from Bangladesh at this moment, but also from other parts of South Asia, and also we are getting a lot of American audiences too. So it's going to be a very amazing discussion, I think. Yeah, David, I always, means as a Bangladeshi photographer, I grew up, means I've been very much inspired by your photographs we have taken during the independence war of Bangladesh in 1971. And I'm sure that there are a lot of photographers in that region who have been watching your different stories from all around the world, as well as the stories you have done during that period in Bangladesh. So these are, I think these pictures have great historical values. And as of course, the stories as a photographer, as you have been traveling at that time, you were covering Vietnam War, and then you came to Bangladesh. So, what inspired you to come to to cover the Bangladesh War in 1971?
Well, I had decided I had been freelancing. I got out of university in the summer of 1968, and I spent a couple of months traveling around Europe. That's kind of what you did if you had a little bit of money saved up. I'm going to go to Europe, and not with my parents and not with my family. I'm just going to go as a grown-up, which it was a debatable point, I suppose. And I'm going to go see what life and art and the world is like out there. I had known really since high school, since I was 16, that I wanted to be a photographer. The previous year, I had had a summer, what now would be called an internship at Time Magazine in New York and in Washington, D.C. And when I graduated and I went to Europe, I just thought, well, I guess I'll come back and start freelancing, and maybe I'll get, not maybe I'll get lucky. I really thought I was like, well, if you print up your business card and you pass out your business card, then the phone will just magically start to ring, which of course never happens. So, like everybody else who began a career as a photographer, there was a lot of learning that had to go on that I wasn't terribly hip to at the beginning. But I managed to keep my connection with Time Magazine, and I worked in Washington for a few months, and then they asked me to come to Florida, and I moved down to Miami, and I worked out of the Miami, Florida bureau for about a year and a half. But by then that was the spring of 1970. No, 69. Sorry, it was April of 1969, and I lived in Miami. I didn't really get very much work. I was, unfortunately, I don't know. I just was not really understanding what you have to do to be a freelance photographer. And that I was still assuming that, well, the phone better ring and somebody will assign me to go do something, rather than just take my cameras and go find a story and go find where the pictures are. I was, when I was 21 years old, I wasn't too smart. I was a 21-year-old kid who didn't know much better. And so I could see that my career was not really booming along. And after a year in Miami, into the spring of 1970, I thought, well, maybe I should think about moving overseas. There was the Middle East. It was always a big story in the Middle East, whether it was Israel or Lebanon or I don't know where else, Egypt maybe. Briefly thought about that, and at one point Time magazine offered me the Beirut bureau. I would have had a very, very different life if I had just said, yeah, great, let's do that, I'll go to Beirut. And I would have probably ended up becoming way more savvy about the Middle East and the Mediterranean and Islamic culture than what I ended up doing, which was going to Vietnam in the fall of 1970. And my brother was getting married. I left in maybe late September, and I passed through Tokyo and Hong Kong on the way there. I bought some cameras in Tokyo. In the days when you could buy a Nikon camera for $150 and a Nikkor mat, which was their kind of junior Nikon camera.
Wow.
I bought 4 of them for $85 each.
Wow.
And those became my Vietnam cameras. And a year
Awesome.
later, I got a Nikon F. This one just still blows me away. A Nikon F, 28 f2, and a 180 2.8, and a 500 mirror lens, all for $500.
Wow.
So
That's
I
a
mean,
great deal.
that was a great deal. Now, in those days, I think we would get paid for a freelance magazine job. You'd make maybe $125 a day. So on that standard, by now we should be getting paid $1,000 or $1,500 a day. But of course, nobody pays that anymore. I mean, the world has changed, and so much of what I used to know as the magazine world has really just evaporated and gone away. But I loved the idea of jumping into this story, and I thought, I got there in the first week of October 1970, and my brother was getting married in November, 6 weeks later, and I thought, yeah, I'll be back for his wedding. And I ended up staying 2 years.
Wow. And you
And
missed his wedding, right?
well, I missed the wedding. I did in those days. It was before CDs, obviously. I say obviously, it wasn't even that obvious. If you're 30 years old, you think that we've always had CDs, and we haven't. But I had a
Yeah.
little audio cassette recorder, and I made a little toast on that, and I mailed it home. And I think they played it at the wedding dinner or something.
Oh, that's very nice.
That was my, in those days, you didn't have this. We couldn't just like tap a few
Yeah.
keys and be talking to the world. It was a very different world. But, and still obviously one in which film was the king, that was the medium. So your way of working as a photographer was very different than it is now. Now, this is the little Sony 6600, A6600. I love this little camera. It's the baby camera. This is probably a 1960s lens from a Bolex movie camera. And it is so awesome on here. I love these. The mirrorless cameras have a very thin body. So when you get a little adapter ring, you can put all these old lenses on these brand new 24 megapixel cameras. And it's just, I have more fun doing this.
Yeah.
Taking a brand new state-of-the-art camera and putting some 70-year-old cinema lens on it, and like, wow, that's cool.
Yeah, absolutely. So you are very well known for using different types of cameras, and it's like experimenting with multiple cameras at a time.
I bought those 4 Nikkor mats when I went to Vietnam, and I almost always carried 4 cameras, because more than anything else, it let you have 4 rolls of film active at a time. You know, nowadays, I mean, I put a card in here, I get what, 2,000 pictures or something. In the days of film, you had 36 on a roll of film. And if you just had one camera, after 36 pictures, you've got to rewind, reload, the whole thing. If you had 3 or 4 cameras, and no matter what was going on, at least you always had one camera that had film in it, even though that didn't always work out. I mean, there are a few times that I blew that too, but there was a sense of, you know, I always would have like a 24, right below that, a 35 or a 50. One shoulder would be an 85 or a 105, and the other shoulder would be the 180. And then I have a bag with maybe 500 or another lens of some kind in there. But mostly the bag had film in it, because you always needed to have 20 rolls of film, because if something really took off and something really was like a good chance to make pictures, you didn't want to run out of film. So you'd have more film. I mean, this is such a completely different way of thinking and being as a photographer now compared to what it was even just 20 years ago, or certainly 25, 30, 40 years ago. But I ended up, that summer I was 20, I just turned 24 years old, moved to Saigon. I lived for a month in a hotel room, and then I moved to a cheaper hotel. And I lived there for a year, and then I moved to an apartment where I started to feel more comfortable just living in the city. And I spent another year. So I was there 2 years working for Time Magazine, because Vietnam, even though it was kind of like, oh, Vietnam, wow, the war, what were the big years there? 66, 67, 68. But even in 1970, it was still a big story, and it wasn't the same story. It was less about Americans being in combat than it was about how the war was changing to become more Vietnamese, and the South Vietnamese with American support. But it was still one of the big stories in the world every day. And at a certain point, I just wanted to be covering a big story. And that was the biggest story for the time being. So I ended up thinking I would stay a month or maybe 2 months, and I ended up staying 2 years. And it was the next summer, the summer of 1971. Actually, just backtrack a little bit. In November of 1970 was almost the first time I went to East Pakistan. There was a terrible cyclone that was just ravaged so much of the country. Larry Burroughs from Life magazine, who was killed in a helicopter crash in the following February of 1971. Larry went to East Pakistan at the time and made all these pictures that I remember thinking, like, wow, these pictures really tell this very tough, very very moving story of these little, you know, big cities and little villages being wiped out by this cyclone, or what we would call a hurricane. And I've since then covered a few of those kinds of stories in the United States. But I ended up not going, and I realized after I'd been there a while, I said, well, everything's a pretty easy place to get to if you go either to Hong Kong, Singapore, or Bangkok. Those were the transportation hubs that would let you pretty much for South Asia get anywhere you needed to be. You know, you could 2 hours. It was an hour and a half to Bangkok, maybe 2 hours to Singapore, and 2 hours to Hong Kong. And from those three places, you could be almost anywhere in a couple hours. So I ended up in July of 1971, as things started to become very bad in East Pakistan, and there was, you know, it was the old story, like politicians who were out of favor and out of the government being arrested, and you know, there are all these terrible stories about what the government of East Pakistan was basically doing to its own people. And it was really, by I think mid-August, or no, sorry, mid-July, it was starting to become really clear to me that there was something going on here that was a story that should be covered. And one of my friends, Dave Kennerly, who I had known in Washington, and he arrived in Vietnam a few months after I did, but he was then a photographer for United Press International, UPI, one of the big wire services. And UPI sent him to Calcutta to do pictures of the refugees who had started coming from East Bengal over into India, into West Bengal. And he only shot for a couple of days, and he came back to Saigon, and we had dinner one night. He said, man, this story is unbelievable. It's just, you can't believe this mass movement of people and what's happening to be such an upheaval that so many people are picking up and going. So I wrote a note to the Time magazine people, and again, it's so hard to make young people who have had a phone in their life their whole time. They've had, oh, look, a phone. I know what's going on in the world because I have my phone. Well, we didn't even really have, we had landlines, but they didn't work very well. Certainly the idea of a cell phone was, nobody was even thinking about that yet. But I wanted to get Time magazine interested in supporting me to go to India to photograph this story. So I sent a note saying what I had seen in the newspapers and what I had picked up. And I said, I'm only 2 hours away from Calcutta, and I could be there by tomorrow night. And I think this is a big story, and there's a lot of human tragedy in what's happening here. I think we should cover this. And I got a note back saying, get there as soon as you can. And I forget the name of the young reporter, but there was a young American reporter who married an Indian girl, and they were back home. And he was, at that point, he was getting a message from the same office that was sending me saying, go to Calcutta and meet Burnett, and you guys do some reporting for us. So I will never, ever forget the ride from Dum Dum Airport into Calcutta that night. I arrived like 10, 11 o'clock, and I'm kind of going through customs at the Calcutta airport and hoping, I mean, all you ever hoped was that you could get through customs without your equipment being impounded. And then that's too much film. You can't, why are you here? Why do you have so much film? And why do you, are you registered with the government? All these things that are always asked of press people and photographers in particular, since we do have these certain elements of what we have to do, just the, you need your cameras, you need a bag of film, you need all this stuff just to be able to operate. So anyway, I get through, and I get into this bus that's going to take me down to Grand Hotel in Calcutta at midnight. And it was the aromas, the smells of cooking fires and smoke, and the sounds. I mean, I'd never been in India before, and I had no idea really what to expect, but it was just, it was fantastic. I mean, I was like, I could just tell there was a real adventure happening here. Oh,
hello.
there she is.
Is it Iris?
That's Iris. That's Iris waving at you guys.
Hello, Iris.
Yeah.
Okay, she's been in India a number of times too. Anyway, I get to Calcutta.
Yeah.
I got to Calcutta that night, and the next morning I met this young reporter, and we went out. We teamed up with a photographer from Statesman, which was I don't know if it still exists even. The Statesman was the Calcutta newspaper of the time. A photographer named Shimadas Basu, and I think, what was the name of our stringer? So at the newspaper, there was a reporter who was also a Time magazine stringer. And because the Time magazine reporter from New York was in town, Prashanto Sakar, I think that was his name. Wow, I haven't thought about him for a long time. And but I do remember that he drank whiskey called Black Knight. And I mean, the stuff you remember about people, right? Black Knight and soda.
Yeah,
And,
it's amazing. It's amazing that you have been, memorizing all these details. It's still after,
I mean, it's the
40
stuff
years.
that you just start to talk about it, and you get a little bit thinking about it. It's like all these little things come back. But we had gone. We were out finding refugee camps, and people were streaming. And I can remember thinking that what really, there were two things that really hit me. I'd already been for almost a year in Vietnam, and the people in Vietnam looked Vietnamese. They were Asian. They had the Asian faces by and large. India, as I'm seeing all these Bengali refugees come across, they didn't particularly, I mean, for the most part, their skin was, I mean, I'm a pretty white guy, so their skin was a little darker than me, but they had facial features that looked like people I had grown up with that lived across the street. And it was like, all of a sudden, just seeing these streams of people, it was like a sense that, what really struck me was that something must be so terrible that has caused all these people to come streaming out. I mean, by the thousands and the tens of thousands and the hundreds of thousands. I mean, the numbers were unbelievable, and these camps were really stressed to try and keep up and to be able to take care of all these people. And I just remember just have this feeling of there's so much humanity that's in distress now. And that's what I have to try and show in my pictures, because that's what do I want to show? I want if you're in France or in Ohio or in California, I want you to feel what I'm feeling by what I'm seeing. And I want my pictures to try and do that. And that's really, I mean, that's what we always are doing as photographers. We're trying to take a viewer and make them feel like they're sitting right next to us and seeing the same thing we're seeing. And of course, you don't have the smells, and you don't have the noise, and you don't have all the other stuff. But pictures do still have an amazing capability to kind of bring people from one world into another, I think. But I remember just being so moved by it, and just seeing all these. Maybe should I put some pictures up here?
Yes, please. Okay. Everyone is waiting to see.
We're not sure this thing works, people, but we're going to try.
Yeah, sure.
So I'm sharing my screen, and now I'm going to go here. All right, can you see it?
Can you please try one more time?
Well, it's the picture of me and the other reporter. Let's see here.
Did you click on the share screen button?
I did. I'll do the share screen again here. Oh, I got another button I didn't hit. Let me hit it this time.
Okay.
Share my entire screen. Okay, we're going to try that one.
Yes.
How about that?
Yes.
Are we good?
Yep.
Okay. So
awesome.
I'm the guy on the left. The guy on the right is named David Greenway, and he was one of the great Time magazine reporters in the 1960s and 70s, and then later went to the Boston Globe newspaper. I think he got tired of just being in all these little villages and, trying to, when reporting became a bigger, wow, that's not the way to put it. There was amazing stories that David covered in this period of 20 years from Vietnam and India and Burma, and he was always getting into places where nobody else could get. Now in this moment, I'm 24 years old, so I think David was probably like 32 or 33. He's a few years older than I am, but he looks so much more worldly, doesn't it? I mean, I feel like I look like such a doofus guy here, but I've got my Nikon or my
I like your
Nikkor
moustache here, so.
well, I've got my poncho and my silly boonie hat and the world's worst mustache. Let's be honest, it's a pretty bad mustache. But I've got an 85 millimeter on my camera, and I had film in there, and I must have just handed the 35 millimeter camera to somebody and had them shoot a picture of us. But this was after we had reported on the refugees. We were back in Calcutta for a week trying to meet up with the Mukti Fauj, which were the freedom fighters, the East Pakistani freedom fighters that I think later they became known as Mukti Bahini, right?
Yes.
I mean,
yeah, Mukti
it's
Bahini.
like 50 years ago, so I may get some of these things wrong. But
it's really amazing
anyway,
that you even pronounce that Mukti Bahini very, very perfectly. So thank you.
Well, thanks. I have a pretty good ear for language, so they say. So, but these pictures, I apologize. Some of them have a big watermark on them, but I think you can at least see some of what it was. And also, I was mainly shooting black and white, and to shoot color was a really big deal. Time magazine still could not just put color in the magazine you couldn't shoot it on Wednesday and have it be in the magazine on Monday. You needed an extra week to get special. On the old printing presses, it was a very convoluted process to get color pictures. But this was something where they said, we'll definitely shoot color, because even if it takes us an extra week, we want to do a color act on this. So this is a man with his little baby in one of the camps. Powdered milk was being distributed, long lines of refugees, both young and old, and just people who were absolutely at their wits' end. And it was very moving, and it's such a humanitarian crisis. I mean, there were, I think, eventually what were considered to be millions of refugees. This is, for God's sake. Can you hear Tyrone barking?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm going to say he's barking because he thought it was a good picture, but
yeah, I hear.
1 second. Just give me 1 second here.
Sure. No worries. Hello again, everyone. Thank you for watching us. Thank you for joining us. I see a lot of comments are coming up. So David, if you just allow me to read a few of these comments in the meantime, so that would be great.
Okay.
Nasir Ali Mamun, one of the greatest photographer from Bangladesh, who has covered Bangladesh 1971 War II, as well as he has covered a lot of prominent personalities in Bangladesh and worldwide. So he has written that very exclusive conversation from a master photographer who was only 24, visited Bangladesh. Salute to this master photographer. Thanks, Andrew Biraj, to arrange peace. Thank you very much, Nasir Ali Mamun, for your valuable comment. So I want to read one more comment from here too. Kevin Crisco, he wrote, love these insights and the way you are sharing your experience with the global community. Can you kindly share your views on growing new photographers of vision and purpose? Who was one of your mentors? What mark did they make on you? How do you intentionally help create and cultivate new visual storytellers now? Thank you for being with us today. So we'll be taking these questions means afterwards in the second half of our conversation. Thank you very much, Kevin, for your comment. Yeah, and I'm going back to David now again. So, yep, David.
Well, I think everybody in this business has run into people along the way who have been encouraging to them and who have helped guide. Some people do it expressly, others do it just by example. And I think in those couple of years that I was living in Washington, D.C. and working for Time Magazine, I was exposed to a number of people: Walter Bennett, Dennis Brack, Fred Ward, Stan Wayman, Charlie Phillips. To me, it was just by seeing how they operated or how they worked and the way they brought a level of both concern about their photography and about trying to do what was right. It was never, what we did was never really like a political polemic. You were just trying to report what was happening in your role as a photo reporter. I mean, we're all reporters, and we do it with a camera instead of with a typewriter or an iPhone, or I guess you could use an iPhone for both nowadays. But it was, I think more than anything, I understood that it was something that as much as you take along the way, you should try and give back. And I have a, I mean, I'm not a great, what's the word for it? I don't know. I don't like active go out and try and find people and say, oh, I'd really like to mentor you and coach you and stuff. But for me, it's much more of a kind of everyday thing. And I love that kind of engagement. I love meeting people along the way, or you see them on a story, you'll run into somebody. I remember how nice people were to me when I was a kid in my teens and 20s. And I try and pass that on to people now that are much younger than I am. I was looking back through these pictures last night, and I'm thinking, well, I've got a few okay pictures here, but I'm not sure I was really good enough that I would have assigned me. And I realized that along the way, as much as was any photographers, there were editors who appreciated the attitude that I brought to a story, and I think had an appreciation of what I was trying to do in an honest and fair way to bring my pictures to life. And seeing things like, I can remember thinking, there had been an outbreak of cholera in some of these camps, and people were trying to do everything they could think of when people would be sick, and especially when babies would get sick. And I remember seeing this woman with this cup pouring water on the head of the baby as if this was going to be some kind of magic potion. I don't know if the baby lived, but that little baby would be 50 years old right now if he lived.
I don't know, means if it's relevant or not, but did you manage to get some names from that time, or like, because a lot of children has born in the refugee camp at this time, right? So
I got nobody's names. I have been one of the, I meant to say that like earlier, is that I am, if they gave an award for being the worst reporter, it's probably an award I would get, in addition to whatever I might have been given as a photo award. I would probably get the worst reporter award. I never got anybody's name. And I think part of it for me became a question of the fact that I was mainly working for magazines. I didn't work for newspapers so much. I never worked for a wire service. And the wires and the newspapers always wanted a name and an age and a hometown of somebody. And I just worked for, Time Magazine, and pictures in the Time Magazine in those days were much less about that actual person than it was about that person representing something bigger. And so for me, there was, you know, I would love to have gotten this guy's name, and I just never got anybody's name. So yeah, I mean, I was a terrible journalist. I was an okay photographer and a terrible journalist.
No, I think it's a very humble of you, but the photographs are, you know, those are right, like very, very important and very historical photographs indeed. So I was just asking for the names because I was more interested about the situation, like how did you manage to uh, you know, means collect, like, you know, means communicate with people, especially did you hire
Well, you know
someone?
what's interesting? So we had hired the photographer from the Statesman, who I mentioned before, Shimado's
Yes.
Basu. And in fact, I can remember the most memorable moment that I remember was we were driving from one camp to another on the second or the third day, maybe the third day. So we'd already, you know, by the third day, I've been over the shock of it, because this was shocking. If you're just thrown into a situation like this, there is no way, if you're even the slightest bit of a sensitive person, you will be shocked by what you're seeing, because it's the movement of humanity. And, you know, this woman in the, like the fourth person in there carrying this giant pot. I mean, this is what her life has come down to, is just the fact that she has that pot and whatever she has hanging onto a kid next to her. I mean, you realize people are really at the end of their rope. And
Yeah.
so by the third day, I'm not shooting everything that I see. Now I'm starting to be able to feel like I can be a little more discerning about what I'm seeing. And at one point, the car pulls up on this country road, and I thought, okay, Shimada, I'm going to just get out here for a minute and shoot a couple of things. And I looked at him, and he has this terrified look on his face. And he said, "Don't do it. I think that's a very bad idea. Stay in the car." I said, what is it? He said, "This is a Naxalite region." And he was just petrified that the Naxalites were going to descend upon us, and then I don't know what other terrible things would have happened. But it ended up, I mean, I just sort of put the cameras down and said, okay, well, we'll go wherever you think it's okay to go. But so many places in between the camps, people would just end up kind of camping by the side of the road, this little baby on a mat. I mean, these were kind of scenes repeated by the thousands and thousands of times as people were in just such desperation to find a place that was safe.
Right.
And we had a caption about this guy, and I can't remember. I think it was something like he had walked 70 or 80 miles to get to this camp in India.
Yeah. So a large body of this work has been shown in the first photo festival in Asia, Chobi Mela, in the year 2000. And we have seen your picture on the poster of Chobi Mela, which became, I guess, one of the most iconic picture of our 1971 war. So, do you have that picture today, or if you want to talk about a little bit about that picture, that would be great.
Well, okay, I'll just get through these. I've got it broken down into two sets here. So,
okay,
this picture was, I remember I had just gotten, about right before I went to Vietnam and went to Asia, I had bought a 24 millimeter lens. Prior to that, a 28 was pretty much the wide angle lens that everybody had. And then some people had a 21, but the 21 was a little too wide. So I remember I had my 24 on here, and I'm just standing in this big tent trying to fill the frame with people, and just to show what this crush of humanity was looking like. And this picture, Actually, it's a similar picture to this. One of the next frames, before or after, ran as a full page in the Time magazine story the next week. And this man carrying this elderly woman through the rain and people lined up there. I mean, it was a shocking situation, and every moment there was something else. And then you would just see this moment of tenderness of this grandmother and the little kid and in a medical tent. And, you know, your heart just was going out to these people every time you picked the camera up. Let me just get through here. Okay, so that's back to, wait a minute, is that? Well, so these are, you know, like I just sort of put these together. This is the hospital near Calcutta. There was a lot of conjunctivitis, which is an eye disease that gets passed around when somebody gets it. And if you rub your eye and then you touch somebody else, it's very easy for this. It's not so much a disease as it is just an eye irritation, but I guess if it's left untreated, it can cause blindness, but mainly it's just people who are trying to be able to see. This dog's going after the dead bodies. And this picture was put together and used as a cover story in Time magazine, which came out in the first week of August in 1971. And it was the first time I'd had a cover picture. I'd had a lot of work published inside Time magazine. And I always had a little bit of a problem with the headline because I thought Pakistan's agony, it maybe either should have been East Pakistan's agony, because just to say it was the agony of Pakistan seemed like maybe not quite the right way to describe it. But it was a, you know, it was a chance for the first time to see one of my pictures on the cover of the magazine. And that has always remained that having a cover of a major news magazine was kind of a big deal, because this is the thing that people first saw when they would be going through by a newsstand or at the airport or something. The cover is what really made people want to look inside and see what else was to follow. So here's an interesting little thing. In 2011, I went with a group of photographers back to Dhaka, to our little groups called Photographers for Hope. And we had done a project the previous year in Brazil. These are all people, for the most part, there's a few professional photographers, but there are people who are politicians, one cinematographer, a guy that owns a photo printing company in Croatia, who's actually Italian, but he's an airline pilot, a German airline pilot for Cathay Pacific, lives in Hong Kong. It's a very diverse group of people who knew each other from having met on different photo workshops. And then I knew one of the members of the group, and we just said, well, why don't we do our own workshop? And so we've done 4 or 5 projects where we just decide, no magazine is assigning us, no newspaper is assigning us. We just pick up and go, and we go somewhere for a week or 10 days. And in 2011, we went to Dhaka, and we all split up. We were about 8 or 9 photographers, and we were doing things on like prenatal care for pregnant women, on clean water at the village level, and what can be done to help people get clean water, and various other social issues. And we shot pictures for a week, and each night we would gather together. And of course, in the digital age, what you're able to do is You go home at 7 or 8 o'clock, you have a little dinner together, everybody, and then you sit around on your laptop, edit the pictures you shot today, and then we would project them, and we would all look at each other's work each night, and it was quite wonderful. And at one point, I remember this man with his little kid, and I thought, my God, this just so reminds me of this guy from 40 years earlier, this man and a baby, and then here's a very upbeat, smiling, this was like the complete opposite of what this Time magazine moment was. This was something really warm and wonderful. I thought, well, sometime I'm going to show these pictures together. So that's why I'm doing this today.
Great.
And this was, and also in 2011, girls playing soccer. And it's not a big deal in a lot of places. Like, there are all these leagues for girls, but in Bangladesh, for girls to be out playing athletics in the open was kind of a big deal. And I just loved seeing that, the girls had as good outfits as the boys did, and they were out playing soccer, and more power to them.
Yeah, you'd be happy to know that the girls soccer team and the girls cricket team both are doing absolutely amazing nowadays.
Oh, that's great. That's
great. On the international level, they're qualifying with the greatest power, and they're doing really great.
That's excellent news. I mean, it's like because it's not something I really keep up with, obviously. Yeah. This kid, we went to a park one day, and I saw this kid with this cricket bat, and he just looked so intense. And so this was not shot with my 4x. I did take my 4x5 camera on this trip, but I think this was one of the other things I enjoyed doing is taking some of my old 35 millimeter film lenses and putting them on 35 millimeter digital cameras. And I think this was shot with one of my old 50 millimeter lenses. I love how that just kind of blanks. Anything that's sharp is kind of whatever is sharp at dead center, and everything else on the edge of the frame goes a little soft and a little dreamy. This was one of the 4x5s in the morning. We had gone down to waterfront, and this barge was brought in, and people were unloading basically one load at a time with a basket overhead, walking on this plank. I did actually get on the boat, and I got back without falling into the water, but I'm not sure how I did it. It's so challenging, and like this woman in front, she makes it look so easy that you just think, well, yeah, it was like just walking from one place to the next. But I'll tell you, to walk on that little plank carrying like 20 kilograms of concrete powder, whatever that was, and over your head is not easy. So it's just, unfortunately, I'm in Florida, and all of my hard drives are in New York. So I didn't have a whole lot of pictures on my laptop that I could share with you from that 2011 trip.
That's understandable, of course, because but I really appreciate that you are showing these pictures even in this difficult time that when we have limited access to go out. So yeah,
let me get rid of this one here. Go back to thumbnails, and then my other window is
may I read some more okay, comments, because there are a lot of comments coming up. So I wanna read very quickly. Mr. Tanvir Habib wrote brilliant, and someone from the Mexico, Far Duenas, he wrote, "Hello from Mexico, amazing live, thanks."
Say that again. What was the last? I didn't hear that last sentence.
Amazing live, thanks.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for tuning in.
So people are connecting from different parts of the world, so they're really amazed to see your images and hear.
That's one of the really fun things that we can do now. Is like when you do something like this, and people You know, people come from everywhere. It's really fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Well, so this, do you want me to go through the second batch of
yes,
pictures?
please, please.
Okay.
Yeah, we are just waiting to hear from you.
Okay. Well, so this this batch here there's a few pictures here, and I think these are Mukti Bahini that this would have been right about the time that the Time magazine cover story came out. And like trying to arrange to meet up with these irregulars was really a lot of work, and they were understandably kind of what's the word? They were a little bit hesitant to invite a journalist in, and all of a sudden, so I was with David Greenway, the fellow in that very first picture, and we had driven out to some place which I can only describe as kind of out in the boonies. I mean, I'm sure we were told to go to a village and then go 500 meters west and then wait for us. And then all of a sudden, out of the woods come these guys. And it was a really cool little moment, I gotta say. It's like, and so we only probably spent a half an hour, maybe an hour with them, and then they took off and kind of disappeared back into the woods, and we went back to Calcutta. And of course, the main thing you had to do in those days was to ship your film and make sure the film was on its way, in my case, on its way to New York. You know, if you worked for a French photo agency, your film had to go to Paris. And sometimes you could just go to the air freight counter and make a package, and then sometimes you'd say, well, let's go find the Pan American Airways round the world flight and find somebody on that plane who's going to New York, and we'll just hand them our film. And so many times I shipped film with people who I just met as they were getting ready to get on a plane. They had no idea who I was, what I was doing. But people have always responded so well to that. Now, of course, you go to Starbucks or Pete's Coffee and get on the Wi-Fi and bada bing, bada bing, bada bing, and you send the pictures out in 5 minutes. But it's I keep telling, this is one thing I do tell everybody who's a digital photographer, that if you really want to see if you're a real photographer, buy yourself a film camera and go out and shoot a roll of Tri-X on the weekend. And let's see if you're a real photographer or if you're just somebody who knows how to shoot on automatic. I love that t-shirt that has the little shutter and function wheel on a camera that has, you know, M, S, A, P, and there's a little arrow next to the M, and it says something like, well, when you're on manual, that's when we really figure out if you're a photographer or not. So, anyway, when the war started in December of like, this is about 5 months after I'd been there, and I came in again. I came into Calcutta. I did go to Delhi for a day, and one of the things they were talking about was that they were going to drape the Taj Mahal in burlap so that it wouldn't reflect at night and be viewable in case the Pakistani Air Force had decided to try and attack Taj Mahal. I'm thinking, gee, that'd be a cool picture. But of course, I don't know who ended up going to Taj Mahal, but I was sent back to Calcutta, and I went into the front on the East Pakistan, West Bengal, East Bengal border. And that's where I hooked up with some Indian troops. And I had this moment on one of the times I was on the road, and I don't know exactly where I was. This was in Jessore, where after the Indian troops had gone through, and a man who was thought to be a collaborator was, you know, vigilante justice took place, and his body was left on the train tracks, and like hundreds of people came to see this. And this is the kind of thing that I'm sure happened a great deal more than we saw. And later, you know, once the Indian and sort of free Bangladesh fighters had arrived in Dhaka, and there was that famous scene at the soccer field where they stabbed a bunch of prisoners with bayonets, and it became one of those stories I was almost glad not to have had to have made a decision about what to do, because I would have felt very uncomfortable photographing that. And I know a lot of photographers who turned and walked away and didn't shoot it. But I was in two big cities, or two relatively big cities, that were liberated by the Indian troops. One was Jessore and the other was Khulna. And, you know, I mean, as in so many things in my life, I have never been back to either of those places, and I'm kind of sorry that I haven't. Well, I got a lot of places I'd like to be back to. This was, I think, in Khulna, Pakistani officer surrendering to the Indian Army. The Indians had tanks. And it was on a road like this that I had been with a couple of Italian journalists and another American photographer. And all of a sudden, this machine gun fire opened up. And, you know, you never, I mean, this was obviously way before the days of a video camera, but the Italian reporter, not a photographer, he was a writer, kind of a chubby guy. Was, if I was 25, he must have been 60. So he'd been around for a long time. And every time the Pakistani machine guns would open up our direction, you would hear these kind of zing, 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 the bullets going overhead, followed by about 20 seconds of this Italian reporter screaming in Italian thing. And I'm sure he was saying something like, "This is the craziest thing I've ever heard of. Why are you trying to fire at us?" And I don't know really what he was saying, but it was just this, like an opera voice of Italian. And then things would quiet, and we were trying to get from one side of, a ditch on one side of the road to the other. And the guy I was with, he went ahead of me, and I could see as he was about halfway across the road, had been just enough time for the machine gunner to swirl the gun around and start shooting again. And I still have this very clear memory of the moment I decided, it was like, well, the hell with it. I'm going to either make it or I'm not going to make it. And I grabbed it. Instead of just running like a normal person, when you're a photographer and you're carrying a bag and your cameras and the camera straps, it's the stupidest thing, but you're not just running full boat. You're kind of running bent over because you want to be a tinier target, and your hands are up over your shoulders to hang on to the camera straps, and your elbows are tucked in around the cameras so the cameras don't fly against your ribs and bruise your ribs. It's like nobody runs as stupidly as photographers do. But I remember getting just over that road and hearing the zing, zing, zing of these machine gun bullets and thinking, gee, you know, it's like the U.S. military had a deal with Pakistan to provide them arms. And here I am being shot at with bullets that were made in Massachusetts. So that is not too cool. So anyway, the war didn't last all that long, but this was I think this was the bridge in Khulna. Somebody can maybe correct me on that the Pakistanis had blown the bridge to try and keep the Indian army from getting across, but they had these inflatable boats, and this was something you could just see. And yeah.
David, sorry to interrupt, but are you trying to show a slideshow at this moment?
Oh, can you not see it?
No, we are just on the screen of your thumbnails.
Ah, okay, hang on. Let me come back here to this. Well, okay, I don't know what happened here. Right,
I
why
think.
don't I stop sharing, and now I'm going to start sharing again. And let's see if I tell it to share. Oh no, application window. There we go. Here we go. Here we go.
Okay.
Here we go. All
Okay.
right.
Sure. Yeah. And if you can just make it full screen from this window. Yeah, that would be great. Yeah.
Are we
So
there?
yeah,
Are
sure.
we there? Okay, I'm sorry. I wish it said something because, yeah. So this was the
Sure.
multi-foge troops, and well, and this is the Indian. I'm sorry, I didn't realize you couldn't see this one. I thought
No, that's okay. Yeah, I think I'm also trying to adopt with this particular technology. So
yeah. And this was the collaborator who had been killed and dumped by the railroad tracks to
the
just
Rajakars.
to let everybody know that this is what happens to collaborators. I guess that's the history of humanity right there. This was when the town of Jessore was liberated. So, I think this is 49 years ago. I think it would be so interesting to figure out, and I don't know why I didn't do this 10 years ago when I was there, to see if there maybe was some way to reprint this picture and see if any of those in a newspaper and see if any of those people might still be alive.
Yes,
40
I think this is very important, especially for the people of Bangladesh and South Asia. And I think that someone that would be really great if there should be some initiative from the government side to publish a proper book with your pictures, because these pictures has to be shown to the next generation. Can I go through a few more comments?
Sure.
So yeah, we are even getting comments from Rio de Janeiro.
Wow.
From yeah, so let me find out. Just give me 1 second for this.
Okay.
And yeah. So C. Rose Berger, she wrote, thoroughly enjoying this interview, such beautiful imagery. Kudrati Khuda, it's a wonderful experience to be a part of a master photographer in a live session. Thanks, Andrew Biraj, for arranging this show. You're most welcome. And Snigdha Zaman, she wrote, great, so happy to see both of you. Love. Nihar Siddiqui, the photographer, Bangladeshi photographer from New York, he wrote, nice to see you. He also wrote later on that the show should have been broadcasted in national platforms. Sean Brahman agreed on it. This program should be kept as a documentary of the liberation war. Absolutely, I agree with you. And
well, we're coming up next year. It's going to be 50 years, right? Next year will be the 50th anniversary.
Yes, it's gonna be the 50th anniversary next year, and of course, like we have gone through a lot. We have came through a lot of difficult and challenging history during this last 50 years. So, David,
on this picture, what does that poster say?
This is a very very iconic artwork which has been made during the 1971. It says Banglar Mayra Mera Shobai Mujib Shena. So it's like we are all the mothers and daughters of Bengal. They're all the fighters of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. the father of nation and of Bangladesh. So let me go through some more. This is amazing discussion by Tawfiq Hassan. Fahim Ibn Sharif said, as David mentioned, I think a touring exhibition in Bangladesh might be able to investigate whether there are anyone alive. That's a very interesting thing. That if you are interested, I don't know, means if any organization can come up with this kind of initiative to 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 investigate your photos and find out the people, of your photos, and if there is anyone still alive, that would be a great thing to do. So David, I wanted to ask you, like, so from Bangladesh, after you were there during the Victory Day, right? In 16 December.
I did not. No, I didn't make it there. I had left Calcutta, and I was driving up with a television crew from NBC Television, and a German crew, at least it was maybe a German cameraman and a Swiss sound man. And all we were able to take with us were a couple of bottles of water and a gigantic bag of oranges, because it was very hard to get food. And I said, hey, do you guys mind if I ride with you? Because I didn't have my own car. So I go in, we get into, this is as far as I got. And you tell me, was Jessore and then Khulna? Does that kind of make sense in terms of
yes, Jessore and Khulna. Khulna is the bigger district.
So the troops were going east. I think first was Jessore and then Khulna. And this was, again, rounding up a bunch of people who were, what's the word? Well, they were sympathizers for the regime, and they'd have to lie with their feet up on a fence, and they'd go along and kind of beat them on the bottoms of their feet, kind of
the Rajakas.
And let's see. And this was at, I think it was in Khulna. By now, I had started to get very sick. And I'd been eating one orange after the next. And then I just started to get these terrible headaches, and I decided that I just couldn't work anymore. I remember being there was a prisoner exchange, I think. And I was I'm in such bad shape that I was sitting in the back seat of this car, an ambassador taxi, with the window rolled down and my 200 millimeter lens up on the edge of the door, because I didn't have the energy to actually be able to shoot by just getting out of the car and standing up. Turns out I had the beginning of malaria. And I hadn't been taking all my malaria pills while I was in Vietnam. And so the last thing I really did was this particular surrender. And I'm sure people who are in the know would be able to tell you who the officers are that are involved here. But I don't know. I was kind of out of it by now, and I ended up going back to Calcutta, and I flew back a few days later. I flew back to the States, and within a week went to the hospital, and they finally diagnosed it. I was back in my hometown in Salt Lake City, Utah, which is in the desert, and where they never see malaria. It doesn't exist there. And fortunately, I had a doctor who had done some work in Kenya, and when he looked me over, he thought it might be malaria, and he was the one who found it out. And so once they figured out what it was, but it meant that I missed the last few days of the final surrender and Dhaka and all of that had gone on. And so in a way, it was kind of an incomplete story for me. And I didn't have a way, you know, I don't think I even ever got to Dhaka until I was there in 2001 with Kofi Annan from the United Nations. So and then I went back in 2011 with our little group, and I spent about 10 days there and really got to know and to like the city much more. But yeah, I mean, I have, like everybody, I have these big holes in my work. Like, I almost get you through the end of the Indo-Pakistan War, but then malaria kind of took over, and I missed the final bit. So, you know, it's part of that whole story, which is about the creation of Bangladesh. I still have to say, I still enjoy getting in a cab in New York City. And, you know, in New York City, we have taxi drivers from all over the world. And, you know, when somebody will say they're from Dhaka, and I give them a Joy Bangla, just Joy like Bangla. 50 years ago. And it was really, you know, it still, for me, is wonderful to be able to have just that little connection. And even though in many cases, they weren't even born yet. You know, you have a 45-year-old taxi driver, and they kind of think about it as an old sense of history, and they know about it, but it's not something they ever lived through. So this is one of those things that I'm just kind of figuring out now that I'm an older person, that, like, not everybody has been around all the years I've been around shooting pictures. So, you know, in a way, that is probably the single greatest motivation for us to take photographs, because for when we age and we move on and we pass away, at least our pictures are left as a little sense of history of what happened in that time that we were alive and working and observing the world. That is really what it's about for me.
Definitely. Thank you very much, David, for, you know, presenting us this kind of incredible, you know, record of history of our 1971 war. I'm really, this war is not only a war in our history. Of course, it has a great emotional and philosophical values in our nation's life, of course.
Sure.
So you have covered this from the front line, and you have witnessed it, and most importantly, you went back several times, and of course, and you spreaded the photos all over the world.
I haven't been back as many times to, for example, Bangladesh as I would like. I mean, I was really glad when we went 9 years ago, because for me, that was a chance to see so much of what I had not seen the first time. And the first time being, you know, 40 years before that. When I went with Kofi Annan, we were only there for a couple of days. It was a kind of a roundup trip through the subcontinent. But I say that for me, it's really, it was a joy, and I hope to get back there. And the one thing I know is, like, I was on in 2007, I think. I was one of the teachers.
I'm sorry.
Jesus.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Well, all of a sudden, at the Joop Zwart masterclass with Shaidul.
Yep.
And we had, oh God, what was I going to say?
All right. So
anyway, yeah. I mean, I'm an idiot. What can I?
No, that's okay. No problem. Let me read some more comments, because we are getting a lot of comments, and I'm very sorry that I'm not able to read all the comments at this moment.
As long as they're really good ones, you can keep reading them. So
yeah, sure. So I wanna say, Faham Ibn Sharif, he said, if such initiative can be taken in cooperation with Liberation War Museum, where they have the capacity to reach the highest number of people. Yeah, that would be a great.
I just want to say one thing we did in
Yes.
2011, which I really thought was great, and I understand. Oh, well, that's what I was going to talk about Pachala and the fact that
Yes.
so many great photographers under the age of, I don't know, maybe 45 now, because some of them
Yes.
are not kids anymore, like, as you
Yeah.
well know.
Yeah.
We all get, if you're lucky and you keep hanging around, you get to add a year every year.
Right.
But so many good, observant, smart photographers have come from Bangladesh, by far exceeding the number of photographers in a society. I mean, there's a lot of really great Bangladeshi photographers, and I think that's one of the things we really enjoyed when we were there in 2011. We did an evening with the photo students, and it was really fun. We got to see what their work looked like, and all of our photographers showed what we'd been doing. And it kind of gets back to this whole thing of trying to keep the flame, the photographic flame, burning by being in touch with people and keeping that going. And one of the things we did with our photographs, rather than do a static exhibition, was we printed out on canvas that was 1 meter high, and then wrapped them around the edge of 10 cyclocabs. And it was like a mobile museum. And the first day we went to the university, and I had to leave that night and come back to New York. But each day, all of these 10 cyclos would come to a different neighborhood, and they would line up and just take the photographs out into the neighborhood. And I thought that was like the coolest thing I've ever seen. I was just blown away by it, and I was really happy to see that this was something that it wasn't just putting it on the wall and making sure that the people who are really into photography might come by and see it at a photo gallery or something. This was taking the pictures out to the people who were in the pictures and letting them see them. So it's
sure. Yeah, I still remember that exhibition.
No shortage of innovation, really.
Yeah, of course. And Shahidul Alam, your friend, thanks to him too, because for bringing up your work and showing us to the nation. I think Reza of Drik, he played a very vital role for curating the exhibitions too. So I hope your message reaches to them. So you have been a very, very, very big inspiration to the photographers, of course. So I'm gonna read another comment from Eric Rose. He said, David is my PJ hero. I did some PJ work in the 70s and 80s, but not at the level David is at. I was just wondering if he feels his new Sonys would stand up to the abuse his cameras took in the 70s and 80s.
I'm not sure I would stand up to the abuse that I took in the 70s and 80s. These cameras seem to be very tough. I mean, they're not, people used to say, oh, you could take an old Nikon F or a Canon F1 and bang nails together with it. They were so tough. I don't think anybody really makes a camera like that anymore, because once you get into the electronics, things have to be a little more, I think inherently they're a little more delicate. But I have had no problems. I'm trying to think if I had, covered now 2 Olympic Games with these digital cameras. And I mean, I had, I used Canons for 40 years, from 1978 up until 2018. And then 2 years ago, I was kind of over the Canons, and I hooked up with the little Sony 6600, and I have also A9 and the A7R3, I think it is. So far, so good. I mean, what I really love is you can get either their wonderful new beautifully designed and made just for the camera. Autofocus lenses, and the autofocus tracking is amazing. But you can also, this is, you know, this old 16mm cinema lens here is fantastic. And so it gives you, you know, if you have a point of view that you're trying to express through your technology, it lets you do a lot of things that you couldn't have done before. I mean, I still have, he said, reaching up, you know, I still
Holga.
got it. Holga. I just got one.
Yeah.
When I realized I was going to be here in Florida for a little while, I had Freestyle out in LA send me a Holga and 6 rolls of film, and I'm on about roll number 4. And basically, I'm just taking pictures of my dog, because that's what you do when you're kind of can't go out of the house and you have, you know, you're stuck like everybody is. But it is, you know, people would ask me with my 4x5 with a speed graphic, well, why are you even bothering to use a camera like that when the digital stuff is so great? Well, the digital cameras are great. Everybody's making great cameras. Those of you who thought you could use crummy cameras as an excuse to miss a picture, your excuse has evaporated. Now we got to just see good pictures from you. But what I really loved about using medium format and large format cameras is that in a way it does tie one hand behind your back. And now you have to think, well, how am I going to be a more brilliant thinker about what I'm going to do to make a picture that will make up for the difficulty and the slowness and the cumbersome quality that these other cameras have. You know, everybody finds a way of motivating themselves in a different manner. That becomes a very personalized thing for all of us, I think.
Yeah, you are very, very well known to carry your, you know, big cameras to the event like Olympics. So you have covered more than 11 Olympics in your lifetime. So
we did add up to 11. I think it might be even 12.
12.
But, I mean,
so,
it's more than, it's double digits anyway. I know it's more than 10.
And you're preparing for the next one, I'm sure. So, and you have been carrying your big cameras all over the Olympics and even in the Capitol Hills to photograph the politicians as well. So, what makes you to adopt this kind of cameras and use this kind of cameras in this kind of fast-paced environment?
I still love the look that I get from that big negative. It's just the physics are different. It has a much narrower field of depth of field. You know, your focus is much more narrow, and it lets you try and do things that look very different than they would look when you're shooting with a 35mm instead of 135mm. I mean, it just makes it look different. And I mean, that's not a very good way of describing why it is different, but it simply is going to be a different look than what you see with your standard digital cameras.
Sure, of course. So
everything has a role, though. Everything has a mission. That's why I have everything. And
yeah. So do
yeah.
So during the Olympics, you know, I remember that I've seen one of your tremendous work in ESPN magazine. You've been covering the Olympics with the big format cameras. So can you please just you know, give us a little bit inside stories, like what exactly do you do? Like, if you explain how do you use that photographs in,
you know,
how do you place it? How do you
on my big camera, I have a reflex viewfinder that fits on the back of the camera, and it lets you look down and see right side up what it is you're looking at and what you're shooting. And I've just gotten to be pretty adept at, I mean, first I'm looking to see what I want to shoot. That's just me looking. I think that's what we all do as photographers. You are just looking all the time, looking, seeing, looking. And when you see it, then you understand. and your head does this little mathematics about, well, I need a wide angle, or I know I need a normal lens, or maybe I need a little telephoto and I need to be standing right over there. So that's where you take your camera and you go stand over there and you put the camera up and you kind of eyeball it and you think, well, that looks like what I wanted it to look like, or maybe it doesn't. And then you have to keep looking. When you find something you like, then you just, hopefully you've become adept enough at what's required. And on a speed graphic, like you see through the little viewfinder and you lock it down, and then you make the focus just right and you lock that down, and then you have to cock the shutter, take your sheet of film, push the holder in, pull the dark slide, and now you can shoot. And then you have to remember to put the dark slide back in the other way. So now instead of a silver outside, it's a black thing. And that black part says, this one's already been shot. Don't try and shoot it again. Because no matter how organized you think you are, you will be making double exposures unintended. It's just going to happen. I've done a million of them. But basically, you just have to work it enough that it becomes second nature. The same as, like, I can pick up this camera now, and I know that if I put my thumb here, that's locking the auto exposure. And if I push C2 up here, the C2 button, that blows up what I'm looking at, and I can use my little manual focusing lens to go just where I want it. You know, I get it focused just on somebody's eye or on something sharp, a feature that I want to be sharp. So it's all very personal. What works for me will probably not work for anybody else that's watching this now. And the same way that whatever it is each of you are doing, it's probably not something that I would look at. I might think, oh, that's the craziest thing I've ever seen. Why would I do that? Well, if that works for you, that's the only thing that matters. And you shouldn't worry about what other people tell you you should or shouldn't have to do. You shoot with the gear that you like. You shoot with the gear that lets you take your pictures. That's the key. Photography's got to become very personal, and it has to be your pictures. And there might be a time when you're standing next to 5 other photographers or 10 other photographers, and you don't have a lot of, you know, you're going to the government center or whatever, and you don't have a lot of leeway to do just exactly what you want. But within the bounds of what is there, you have to still try and take your version of that picture and make it the one that you want to take, and not the one that this one over here or the one over here wants to take.
Absolutely.
Make it personal.
Absolutely perfect.
I just want to say one last thing.
Sure.
Which is, all the years that I started working as a young magazine guy in my 20s, I never really thought so much. I mean, I have a few pictures of the family and I have pictures of friends and stuff. What I never realized at the time was that those pictures, the pictures of your very own personal life, not the one that's going to be in Time magazine, not the one that is going to be, you're going to pay for by the newspaper or something. Those pictures are all well and good, and keep all of your files, keep your negatives. But the really important pictures, when you get to be my age, are the ones of your very own life, of your friends, your family, your pet, your dog. I mean, my dog, I got a million pictures of my dog, and he's like the coolest guy I know. So that's where I want to shoot those pictures. And those pictures, I look back at the stuff that I shot 20, 30, 40 years ago. The really important things that resonate with me are the ones that were of the people in my life. So don't feel you have to only shoot when you're being assigned by an editor. Shoot enough that all of your friends get really tired of it, and your family, like I'm sure almost everybody watching this, I don't know where you all are, but we've all gone through the thing. You're walking with your family, your wife, your girlfriend, your boyfriend, whatever. and you stop to look at something and you can see that, like, wow, look at that shadow, and there's the sun is over there, and in about 10 minutes that shadow is going to perfectly line up with the edge of that building, and all you ever hear is, can't we just go somewhere once and just go there, and we don't have to stop and take pictures? But you know, that's the joy of it. It's like you'll see something, those other people don't see it. So that's what we want to be trying to snag in your photography.
Absolutely, some very insightful suggestions, of course. David, if you have time, I'm not sure, like, I'm how much time I'm snatching from you, but if you have time, if I want to go back to your work a little bit more. So you brought out a book of Bob Marley, and that's Soul Rebel. So do you want to talk about the book a little bit? I think that the pictures were unpublished for a long period of time, and then you
they
came up
were
with the book.
published in a few music magazines, but they were not widely published. And it was a Time magazine assignment. I got sent to Jamaica for about a week or 10 days, and photographed a number of musical personalities and singers in particular. And then finally, the last thing we did was to photograph Bob Marley at home, and I spent maybe a couple of hours there, not very much. And a year later, I happened to be in France when they were beginning, the band was beginning the Exodus tour, and I had another assignment from Rolling Stone magazine to go spend a few days with the band, which I did then. And it was years later. I mean, that was 1977. And it wasn't until about 2009, so it's like 23, 30, like 30 years later, that I found somebody who was interested in this work. And, you know, it was the really the coolest part about that project was that once I had shown Bob pictures of the things I did in Jamaica a year later when we're traveling on the bus, he really liked some of those pictures. And so as far as he was concerned, I was okay. I had film on my camera. I was going to take real pictures, and I could do anything I wanted without having to worry about being, you know, I didn't have, there was no supervision. He could do whatever he wanted, and I got to just hang around with a camera. And that's really the best thing that's the coolest thing we get to do in this business, I think. So I hooked up with Chris Murray of the Govinda Gallery, which had been a photographic gallery in Washington, D.C., and he specialized in musical subjects, and he loved the pictures. So we did a book, and that's how Soul Rebel came into existence. And I think it's actually, at this point, it's hard to find because it's sold out, and I don't think they're making another printing of it.
And you also photographed all the American presidents since Nixon, and you recently photographed
Kennedy, actually.
Kennedy.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yeah. So
right.
you recently photographed the impeachment of Donald Trump too. So how do you see the American history, and when you have been always recording the American history through your photos? So how do you see?
I've been trying. I've certainly been trying. I mean, the impeachment, I was one of the few people, I mean, I don't really know who else kind of got into it, but who photographed the Nixon and the Clinton and the Trump impeachments. There are maybe one or two of us that did all three. And, you know, if you live long enough, you get to do some of these things. I did take my big camera to the impeachment hearings, and that made a bit of a stir because there aren't many people shooting with large format cameras anymore. But I really, I just felt it was a very historic, you know, he ended up being not found guilty, the same as Clinton, by the Senate. So that by then that part of it became very hard to photograph, because you're not allowed to be in the Senate. There's no photography allowed. It's still one of these old rules that probably predates the idea of even having photography. But you know, it's just another one of those stories that I think in the end of this year, after the election, and presumably we're going to have an election in November, and we'll see what happens there. But we're living at a time when there is just a great deal of unimaginable stuff going on. It's very hard to predict what's going to happen. And in politics, it's becoming harder and harder to predict that. So if you're somebody who covers politics, this is a time to really, you know, load up your film holders and go take pictures, because it's not going to end right away. And there is so much, the country is so divided here. It's really terrible. I mean, what I see around the world is how many countries are divided. I mean, when you see in Bangladesh what's going on, in Brazil, in the Philippines, you know, there's this Hungary, there's this breaking into either two factions or sometimes more than two factions. Neither side wants to talk to the other side. Each side thinks the other side is a complete idiot and the worst thing ever. And so we're all stuck kind of trying to figure out what in the hell we're going to do. And, you know, in the end, it's kind of our job to try and follow these events and to record them for history so that at least they don't go unrecorded.
Sure. I think we are almost at the end of our live session. I just want to read few more comments.
Okay, only if they're good ones. Okay.
Yeah, of course. all the good comments are coming up. We have received tremendous numbers of comments. So Imtaz Ahmed from Virginia, she wrote, "I'm touched by how beautifully Dave is describing and remembers all the details even after almost 40 years. Thank you for sharing your journey and your work with us."
Well, I have to say, I think I've always had a pretty good memory, but there's something about looking at a photograph. Like last night when I was putting together the refugee pictures, there were a couple of pictures that just, you look at a photograph, especially if you haven't looked at it for a while. And that's really what the power of photography is, I think, is that it just taps you on the shoulder and says, hey, you remember that? Or you remember that kid? Or you remember these people?
Yep. So one last thing I want to ask you before we end up this session. I have taken almost 1 hour and 42 minutes. So you mentioning about that the difficult political time all through the world at this moment, and we are now got this, you know, is going through this pandemic, which we have probably never thought of before, and at the same time that the lot of photographers are coming every day, you know, there people are getting more interested on photography and visual arts every day in the world, but not only for the Bangladeshi photographers, for the, you know, it's all around the world. What are your suggestions? Like, what are your key advices for the photographers to serve in future to the new world?
Well, the one thing I know is that I was lucky to have started out and done my work at a time when there were a lot of magazines, and the magazines had a lot of money, and they could afford to send you to go to a place that you'd never been before, whether it be India or South Africa or Peru or Brazil. And those days don't exist the same way. It's so hard to find any kind of a client that has money to, even if you bring a good idea, they're just like, yeah, it's a great idea, but we just don't have the budget for it. The internet has kind of killed off so much of what we used to rely on as a source of interest and motivation and and financial resources to be able to do these, to do projects. You know, most of the editors I worked with over the years, if I came with a good idea, they would just say, go do it. It's hard to beat that. Nowadays, you might have people who think it's a great idea, but it's like, God, we don't even have a budget to send you anywhere. So in so many ways, I see very talented photographers, young people in their 20s and sometimes in their 30s, and they're just kind of like stuck. Where do I go? What do I do? I don't really know what the answer is. We were all kind of hoping that, you know, at one point, well, the iPad, that'll be the new magazine. Well, that didn't really work out. Well, the internet, you know, well, the internet, everything is everywhere and no one wants to pay for anything. So that isn't really such a great deal, because you don't get, you're not getting somebody who will say, oh yeah, $1,200 for a ticket to go there. Well, just go and bill me for it. I know that that doesn't happen. Occasionally it'll happen now, but it doesn't happen with any of the kind of regularity it did when I was a young working photographer. And if you had an idea or a proposal, people would go for it. So I don't know what that answer is. My inclination is just to feel that on one hand, I was a lucky guy to live at a lucky time when the technology wasn't so outlandishly amazing, and there were still the relative volume and pace at which work was being produced and reproduced in magazines and newspapers was such that you could kind of get a handle on it. Now there is so much work being produced. Who even has time to see everything now, let alone see something and be able to really reflect on what it means and what it's about? So I don't know. I wish I had an answer. I don't have that answer. I see every day one or another newspaper goes out of business. It's terrible. And now that we all get to choose what our news is, people are so ill-informed as a rule. It's amazing. Well, I don't want to believe that news. I'm going to believe this news. Well, that's the stupidest thing I ever heard of. When I was, you know, in my 20s and 30s, the news was the news, right? The news was what happened. And it didn't always require it being given a spin or some other way of trying to sell it. You know, the news stood on its own 2 feet, and I fear we've lost that in so many ways. And now everything is politicized. You know, countries one after the other divided into 2s or 3s or whatever of, you know, you're on this side or that side. Well, that's a terrible way to be. You just want to be on the side of the people or on the side of the country, and that's not easy to do anymore. So I don't know. All I would say is, if you're really committed to feeling that photography is the way you want to express whatever that energy is that maybe sometimes is even hard to describe, don't stop taking pictures. Maybe you have to have another job to make it work. That might be the deal. But if you want to build an archive of photography, don't let anything or anybody get in the way of that.
That's a very, very important advice, of course, for especially in this difficult period in this of the world. We are at the end of our live session. We have taken almost 2 hours now, and I'd like to give a big thanks to David Burnett for joining this live session and, you know, sharing your views and sharing your photos and historical photos, of course, to our viewers. We have
for tuning in. This was fun. I mean, it's well known that I can just give me a Diet Coke with lime and I can talk for hours.
We appreciate that. We truly do. We truly appreciate your time and your effort. I hope that you know, by this live, you know, a lot of not only the Bangladeshi audiences, but audiences from all over the world have learned some historical moments about the Bangladeshi 1971 War of Independence through your photographs. So Absolutely.
I can't tell you how fast 50 years can go by. That to me is the freaky thing.
Sure. I apologize to our audiences that we have received tremendous numbers of comments, which is still a lot of.
Can you post them somewhere?
Yeah, sure, of course. I wanted to mention it that this live video will be shared to the profile, to the Facebook profile, my Facebook profile, Andrew Biraj Photography, as well as David Burnett's Facebook profile. Also, it will be shared to my YouTube channel, Andrew Biraj. So,
are you going to have a link that we could put like a Twitter link, and we could just boom it out to the entire world?
Yeah, of course.
The whole world.
I was pretty much backward to manage this kind of technology, but I'm pretty much sure that I'll be able to share this.
Kid somewhere who will teach you how to do it. That's my secret weapon. I find a 13-year-old. They do this stuff so fast that you can't even imagine what you're looking at.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you very much, Dave. And we all wish you good health and a very good time ahead.
Oh, one thing. Well, wait, one thing. My last little
thing
here. I've got my. This was a T-shirt of my dog Tyrone. And by the way, I got to give a plug to Tyrone's Instagram page, which is They Call Me Little Tyrone. Okay. Anyway, don't forget to take your mask. It doesn't affect your ability to see or to shoot pictures. And we'll get through this thing, and then we'll go back to just being the same old boring people we were 4 months ago. Okay?
Sure. Thank you. You have a very good day.
Thanks, man. Take care. Bye, everybody.
Bye.